Hola a todos, buenos días, tardes, noches, según el lugar del globo en el que os encontréis, al atender este curso seminario El mundo después de la pandemia, organizado por la Academia de Pensamiento Crítico y la Fundación de Investigaciones Marxistas. El eje temático en el que nos encontramos es en el del mundo multipolar y declive imperial, y la ponencia con la que nos va a ilustrar Vijay Prashad es China, capitalista o socialista. Vijay Prashad, antes que nada, comentar que es historiador, editor, periodista, intelectual indio, es director ejecutivo del Instituto de Investigación Social Tricontinental, ha sido catedrático de Historia del Sur de Asia del Trinity College de Hartford, Connecticut y de la Universidad de Beirut. Es corresponsal principal de Globetrotter y columnista de Frontline, India, y es el editor jefe de Leftward Books de Nueva Delhi. Entre los más de 30 libros que ha escrito están Las Naciones Oscuras, una historia del tercer mundo, está Washington Bullets, Balas de Washington, historias de la CIA, Intervención y Golpe de Estado, y también Primavera Árabe, Invierno en el Líbano, una posible historia de los pueblos del sur global. Así que, sin más dilación, empezamos esta ponencia. China, ¿capitalista o socialista? Adelante, Vijay Prashad.
Well, if you ask the question, is China socialist? This might not be the most productive question to start with. Probably the best question to start with is how does one understand the dynamic of such a large part of the world as what is now the People's Republic of China? 1.4 billion people, maybe 1.5 billion people, a landmass that's quite considerable, all the way out from Xinjiang province. Xinjiang province borders a number of countries, Kyrgyzstan, all the way up to Mongolia. A very large province, 2.5 times the size of France. I just want you to consider that Xinjiang by itself is 2.5 times the size of France. We're talking about a very large country. Now, the thing to remember when you ask the question of China is you always need to start with its history. You really need to understand the history of China. To take a snapshot today, what is China now, is not significant. You won't understand what China is, what its logic is. I'll give you an example. Because even the Chinese as a project, as a people that have something in common with each other, take a very long view of what they're doing. You'll remember there was an apocryphal statement made by Zhou Enlai, one of the communist leaders. He was asked, what do you think of the French Revolution? And he said, it's too soon to tell. It's too soon to tell. I've talked to Chinese intellectuals, Chinese political people. I'll ask them, what is your anticipation for next year? And they start talking in 5, 10, 15, 20, 100-year sequences. They're thinking in the long term. They're not thinking like capitalists do in the West. In every second you must make money, quarterly returns and so on. Time has become very telescoped in many parts of the world. In Europe, in North America, in other places, in India as well, time has become telescoped. We think in the short term, which is why in our countries we don't make long-term investments. Capitalists want to take profits quickly. They don't invest for the long term. They're not in it. They're not in it in a sense for a long project. Everything is how long your term as the prime minister lasts. Is it 4 years, 5 years, whatever the term? You're worrying about getting re-elected in 5 years. They have a different understanding of time, a different conception. They want a bigger project, a larger project. And that's why I want to put that on the table. Asking the question, is China socialist? You can't answer that as if you're talking about a prime minister's cabinet which lasts 5 years. This is a long-term project. This is not a 15-minute game. It's a long-term project. You look at Chinese history in the 19th century, the Chinese till today remember the great humiliations of the 19th century, the great humiliations. China was much weakened by its history, hadn't advanced internally in many ways, economically, politically, socially, and so on, had been in a sense caught in a kind of historical grip. As a consequence of that, China was obliterated by the British twice in the two opium wars. The British forced the Chinese to buy opium to balance the books of the English East India Company. The British seized Hong Kong, and held it until 1997. Now you'll hear Europeans talk about democracy in Hong Kong. Please remember that the British held Hong Kong as a colony without any rights until 1997. Please remember that. It's the same kind of people who talk about democracy in Hong Kong who support the British rights over Malvinas Island, which by all counts, should be part of Argentina, what the British call the Falkland Islands. What's the difference between the Falkland Islands and Hong Kong? It's that colonialism believes that it has rights over territories far away. And the Chinese suffered those humiliations. Till today, they'll remember them. You want to start talking about unequal treaties, they'll tell you about the invasion of China by Japan and the seizure of Manchuria. They have a long perspective. These are not histories for them. These are realities, that they have to deal with. China went into World War II much earlier than Europe, but not much earlier than Spain. Spain, like China, had an early beginning of World War II. Spain's World War II begins in the so-called Civil War, which really wasn't a civil war. It was a war between the fascists and the Republicans, where the Republicans were fighting for a certain vision of Spain, and the fascists, bringing the colonial army from Morocco, wanted to disrupt them and defeat them, led by General Franco. That is an early part of World War II. Similarly, the Japanese and the Chinese begin World War II with the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937. That war will go from 1937 till 1949, my friends. And that's the difference between Spain and China. Is Spain starts World War II as early as China, but it ends much faster than the Chinese war, which goes on for 12 years. It's a 12-year war. And that war destroys the physical plant of the country. That war also leaves China one of the poorest countries in the world. You have a communist revolution in 1949. The Communist Party comes into power in China in 1949, inheriting an extremely poor country. Now, I want to make two quick parallel observations about this before I go forward. Firstly, all communist revolutions in world history, from the revolution against the Tsarist Empire in 1917 all the way out to the Cuban Revolution, all communist revolutions in world history have taken place in extremely poor countries. All communist revolutions have taken place in peasant countries, countries with a large peasantry. Didn't follow the axioms of the Second International, where the expectation was that revolution would happen in Germany or in Britain or in the United States. These countries never had and have not yet had a socialist or communist revolution. Revolutions took place in the Tsar's Empire, in Mongolia, in Vietnam, in China, in Cuba, in Burkina Faso, and so on. Not in Germany, not in Sweden, not in Spain, not in Italy. They never made a revolution. So these countries in poverty had to do two things. They had to first create social wealth, and they had to at the same time socialize that social wealth. Marx's assumption was that capitalism would take on the historical task of producing social wealth, which then socialism would change the relations of production, socialize production, and also socialize the wealth, use the wealth for social good. But the tragedy has been that every communist revolution has taken place in countries where, because of colonialism, capitalism has refused to fulfill its mandate of advancing the productive forces, of creating social wealth. So in these countries, they had to do two things: produce social wealth and at the same time socialize that wealth itself. Now, you have to look at the Chinese experiment based on that axiom, that right from 1949, the Chinese leadership has struggled and made a lot of errors, but struggled to increase the social wealth in order then to socialize it. Any Chinese intellectual will tell you, You cannot socialize poverty. The road to the socialism of poverty is Pol Pot's Cambodia. Nobody wants that. You have to increase the productive forces. That's an imperative. During the Mao reform era from 1949 to 1978, they advanced human capacity, increased the consumption of food, they increased literacy rates, they eradicated to a great extent hunger and so on. They really made amazing strides between 1949 and 1978. Then from 1978 and deeper in 1992, they advanced the productive forces development through the so-called reform era, the Deng era of reforms. They advanced the productive forces because, again, by 1978, it became clear that you just can't socialize poverty. You have to have some social wealth. And to that end, that was the experiment. And from 1978, the Chinese leadership has zigged and zagged between advancing the production of social wealth and socializing their wealth. They have seen classic inequalities rise. They keep trying to minimize that. As a consequence of this policy, in this 60-odd year period, the Chinese have abolished absolute poverty in China. 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty. This is a singular human rights achievement of our time. 800 million people. Nobody denies those statistics. The United Nations looks at the data and says, this is amazing. 800 million people lifted out of poverty. I said I was going to make two observations about this. The first was this, that most revolutions have taken place in poor countries. And if you look at the Chinese story, they have made enormous gains, both in social wealth and in the socialization of that wealth. Secondly, as a comparison, India wins its independence in 1947. India and China have comparable populations, both about 1.4, 1.5 billion. In China, they have, over the course of the 60-year period, lifted 800 million people out of poverty. India, during this period, continues to have about 700 million Indians who go to sleep at night not knowing if they'll have a full belly. Okay, I just want to reflect on that. China lifted 800 million people out of poverty. India has 700 million people in poverty who don't know if they'll eat any night. If you had a choice between being born in a bottom quintile in India or a bottom quintile in China, which would you pick? I can tell you, nobody is going to pick India. Free speech, what do you mean by free speech? The freedom to starve, is that what you mean? What do you mean by human rights? The right to have disease run rampant, COVID-19, nobody caring for you, dying on the street? What are you talking about when you talk about human rights? Let's clarify the meaning of some of these concepts. So that's the second observation I'd like to make about the long stretch. Now, coming to the issue at hand. In 1978, when China conducted the initial reforms and when they deepened the reforms in the 90s, the Chinese government and Chinese private companies did something clever. Rather than every other country in the world, which essentially opened the door to foreign capital, the Chinese said, you can bring your capital in, but you must teach us the science and technology behind what you're doing. You see, the Chinese understood that today's technology is yesterday's science. So you have to understand science in order to develop tomorrow's technology. It's because they made this decision to call in science, to bring in technology, because they made this decision in several key areas. China is today the world leaders in the production of things. For instance, in 5G technology, in robotics, in GPS technology, in weather prediction technology, in green energy technology. China is a generation, perhaps 2 generations ahead of capital in the West, in Europe, in the United States, and so on. And this is principally what is most threatening about China today to the West. Why the West is prosecuting a Cold War, hybrid war against China, is because they want to disrupt this technological advance. Chinese telecommunication companies will run European and US telecommunication firms out of business because nobody can compete with them. Not only do they sell the equipment cheaper than is produced in Europe and the United States, but it's also better because it's better technology. This is a direct threat. Now we see in recent years people of the left, in the West and so on, make these kinds of comments. This place is not socialist, this place. You see, this kind of judgment is based on abstractions. It's not understanding the historical process. Genuine historical materialists don't look at a country's situation and judge it based on an ideal type. Then you have a Platonic form of leftism. You are Plato, you're not Marx. Marx would look at the dynamic of China in terms of the full sweep of its historical development, keeping a special eye on the materialist conditions of a country, the development of its productive forces. You see, Marxists are not social idealists or utopian socialists. We don't look at something and say, let's immediately, by a force of will create socialism. Socialism doesn't get created by a force of will. That's what Fourier, Saint-Simon and others were trying to imagine. And Marx did a very rigorous critique of them. You have to understand the material conditions of society. Marx and Engels write in the German ideology that communism is not something that you impose or bring into the world. It's the real movement of history. You've got to look at the real movement. That's why I wanted to give you, in this brief time, a sense of the general dynamic of Chinese development. I believe that the answer to the question, is China socialist, is the following. Go and study Chinese historical materialist development. Go study it. Look into it. What do you think? What do you think they are up to when they abolish poverty in the country? What do you think they're up to when COVID-19 disease strikes and they decide that everybody must be fed, everybody must be taken care of, when they build a hospital overnight virtually, when Communist Party members who are doctors come to Hubei province and tell doctors who are not in the party, if you don't want to treat people with COVID-19, please leave. It's not a shame. You're worried. We will take your place, we as Communist Party members. When you look at that evidence, what do you think? Is China socialist? Take a look at it. Where are the doctors from Europe, traveling the world trying to heal people who are struggling with COVID-19? No, you see doctors from Cuba, and you see doctors from China. You simply don't see doctors from elsewhere. In Italy, there were doctors from China in Lombardy in the high point of the COVID-19 episode. Where were the doctors from the United States? Where were the doctors from France? Where were the doctors from Spain? Why do Chinese doctors go abroad? Because they have a socialist ethic. Is China socialist? I don't want to answer the question for you. Why should I do that work for you? Go and find out for yourself.